So good morning, everyone, to the fourth session in the Swaraj Indic Academy Book Club webinar series. And today we are delighted and honored to have Professor Subhash online from the US. And it's about, what, 8:30 in the morning for you, Professor, or a little later than that?
It's 9:30 at my place.
Okay, so that's the US Central Time. So we are here today to talk about Professor Kak on his latest book, The Wishing Tree, that has come out very, very recently. And for those of you who don't know, Professor Kak is a Kashmiri. He was born in Srinagar, and he has been he's a Regents Professor at the Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. And he did his education in both Kashmir and Delhi. And he has written 14 books on a wide variety of subjects that include history of science and art and another 6 volumes of poetry in English and Hindi. And his work has been showcased in popular media, including the Discovery and History channels, PBS, etc. His areas of specialization at the university are quantum mechanics and cryptography, on which he has made some seminal contributions. And with that, a big welcome again to you, Professor Kak. And I will, before we get into the questions, I will lay out a couple of ground hygiene rules. One is that we will leave the Q&A till the end, and people can send in their questions either through chat, or at the end when we open it up, they can ask their questions. We are recording this, so we will be putting up both a video and a sound and audio recording of this on the net. Hopefully, if internet bandwidth cooperates tonight itself. If not, then definitely by tomorrow. And with that, let's get started. So again, big welcome, Professor Kak. And your book, The Wishing Tree, is short. It's, I think about 200 pages or so, but it covers a wide range of issues and topics. And the blurb says it is based in part on 3 invited lectures at Stanford University and the University of California that you gave. Before we get into the book itself, can you talk about then what led you to take these 3 lectures, these invited lectures that you delivered, and turn that into a book? And what was your thinking when you did go about turning these lectures into a book?
Thank you, Abhinav, and welcome to everybody. I'm delighted that I'm a part of this webinar. Now, the first question, what happened was in the 1990s, I was sort of lucky to come by this new understanding of the astronomy of ancient India, which is my discovery of the astronomical code of the fire altars, which is also a part of the very organization of the Rig Veda. And this obviously has a lot of implications for our understanding of ancient Indian history, and also history of other ancient cultures, because these two are intertwined. So as a consequence, I got into the lecture circuit. I was literally out every week in some university or the other across the United States, and also India and elsewhere. And at some point, I decided that, we need to also do something to bring these ideas beyond the academic world to the laypersons. So we did a book with 2 collaborators called In Search of the Cradle of Civilization, which came out, I believe, in 1996. But then I also decided to write popular pieces on it for online magazines and for newspapers. And after some point, I did have a substantial amount of material at hand. And that was prior to these 3 lectures that I gave at University of California, Berkeley, at Irvine campuses, and at Stanford. So I thought it would be a good hook to hang these lectures on. But I could have also said Harvard or Michigan or Illinois and so on. And then I've added to that material. And so it's a kind of a broad compilation. And my model for this book was the great book by Ananda Kumaraswamy, called The Dance of Shiva, which personally had been very influential in my own understanding of the very heart of Indian civilization.
Wonderful. So we are all, I think, thankful that you did go out almost every week on the lecture circuit and then turn this into a book. And with that, I'll get started with the book itself. And early in your book, you talk about when people talk about the origins of Indian civilization, one of the arguments made is to take this so-called Proto-Indo-European language and give it a home in somewhere in Central Europe or Europe. And you talk about how a linguistic Garden of Eden called the PIE, the Proto-Indo-European language, was postulated, and Europe was taken to be the homeland of this language. Your argument is that by appropriating the origins, the Europeans also appropriated the oldest literature of the Indians and that of other Indo-European speakers. And you write, and I quote, "Without a past, how could the nations of the empire ever aspire to equality of the West?" End quote. And in some ways, it seemed when reading this that this theft of the Indian civilization's very roots is in some, I have to admit, it is breathtaking in its scope, ambition, and even brazenness. Wouldn't one be inclined to say that this theft has had the desired result of producing, entire generations of Indians who at several levels feel ashamed of their Indianness itself?
Absolutely. I think that is right. What happened was that the whole problem, if I may put it that way, of Indian ancient history was intertwined with the issues of power that the European nations dealt with in the 19th century. The whole question was, well, why is it that if India has such a magnificent past, because there was no dispute of that, then why is it that Indians have not been able to manage their own affairs? Why have they been defeated? Why are they politically subservient to other nations? So as an explanation, the fact or this narrative was adopted that really this past truly belongs to the people who came into India, say 3,500 years ago. And since their arrival in India, it's all been downhill. There's been religion, there's been a lot of emotion, if you will, or emotional literature, bhakti and this and that. But as far as the higher expressions of human imagination are concerned, there's not been very much of that. And but let me step back and address two aspects of it. It's perfectly okay for somebody to say whatever they want, because people can say whatever they want. I think the fact that this narrative was expressed in itself is not all that terrible a thing. What is terrible is the consequence where Indians have not stood up and spoken of what the facts are. Now, it's not quite true that they haven't, but clearly when it was done, it was probably brushed aside. And Indian past itself became a very, very important political issue, because the politics of contemporary times were entangled with what might have happened in remote past. Now, in other cultures and civilizations, that's not an issue. For example, if you go to Japan, historians would say, well, the Japanese are not a homogeneous people. There were these Polynesians and maybe other ancient cultures who finally created a homogeneous civilization. Whether that's true or not does not matter to the modern Japanese. And what historians or archaeologists or historians of religion might want to believe about ancient India should not have mattered. But sadly, this is one of those unique things in the world history where even now people get very, very excited about. Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, my apologies. I had muted myself and forgot to unmute myself. This is, you've touched upon a topic that even today generates a lot of passion and intensity, at least from the Indian side. And very, very, much related to this, I don't want to spend too much of our time in this Q&A on this topic, but I do want to touch briefly on the Aryan invasion myth before we move to other more fascinating topics. But in your book, you cite the British anthropologist Edmund Leach's famous essay that you write exposed the racist basis of the 19th century construction of Indian prehistory. And yet, paradoxically, it is us Indians in large numbers who continue to argue against this myth and believe in an Aryan invasion, an Aryan migration, settlement, the trek, walk, jog, or whatever they choose to call it. And anyone who argues on the basis of evidence is branded as parochial, ignorant, and I've even seen some comments saying that anyone who believes in the Aryan invasion theory is who argues against our Aryan invasion theory is stupid. One comment was a typical right-wing lack of intellect or something to that end. Why is it that whereas everywhere else these racist origins have been rightly called out and it is considered academically, the equivalent of committing academic suicide if one were to use these theories in other spheres, why is it that when it comes to India and Indians, it is considered par for the course to continue to write about and treat these, theories as gospel?
Well, two sides to this question. First, clearly what might have happened in the remote past was complicated. And perhaps there were migrations one way or the other. Although Stephen Oppenheimer, in his most recent synthesis, argues that the Homo sapiens came from Africa and came to India about 80,000 years ago. And within India, over a period of 40,000 years, there was adaptation to different climatic conditions. And then the settling of Europe towards the northwest and Asia, that is China and Japan, towards the northeast, occurred due to migrations from India 40,000 years ago. But that doesn't mean that there were not people going back and forth. So that, in my view, should not matter. I think if things were all fine, people would say, okay, there are a lot of theories, and this is one of the theories, and maybe it doesn't settle everything. Perfect. I think as far as the issue in the book was concerned, what I was addressing mainly was the whole question of the chronology of Indian texts, because Max Muller and other scholars had said, well, about 1800 BC or later on, and therefore all of Indian sciences ought to be given this time period. However, when you look at the texts that followed the Rig Veda, for example, the Brahmana, the Shatapatha Brahmana, and so on, you find that it has astronomical indicators which speak of, say, 2000 BC, or there are other astronomical markers because of the precession of the Earth, and therefore one can always do that, go back to about 3000 BC and so on. But I think one reason why that was not looked upon favorably by scholars in the 19th century was because the West was also trying to create a chronology for the rise of civilization in Europe itself. And they thought that if we were to accept 2500 BC or 3000 BC, although there were many Western scholars who did so. So it's not that it was a monolithic view completely controlled by Max Muller and his followers. So I think the real issue is slightly more complicated. It's not even about the migrations of people. The real issue was, did India have science? And what time did science arise? Because really, everybody knows, even in Europe, well, perhaps the original inhabitants of Europe were people who spoke Basque or languages related to Etruscan or Finnish, right? So it's not the migration of people. Or the Celtics do remember that they came in from the east. And likewise, the German groups also came in from the east. So I guess it was really a contest for, is the Indian civilization, does the Indian civilization have science? it does have religion. Everybody accepts it, right? The mythology associated with the Vedic books of the Brahmanas or the Puranas, but does it have science? And now, of course, there is science in the Shulba Sutras. There's geometry. And what the historians of science did was to say, well, the Shulba Sutra geometry must come after Euclid. So there was an attempt to say it's 300 BC and not 800 BC or even earlier, which now scholars of mathematics do accept it's 800 BC. So now what happened then was that if Indians had an astronomy as in the astronomy of the fire altars, which is what my contribution was, then it was going to be a very big thing, because that would imply that Indian sciences were not derived from Mesopotamia or from Greece, and that would completely alter the fundamental ground on which history of ideas has been written, namely that it arose in Greece, and then there was some concession made that perhaps certain things came from Mesopotamia. And if you look at progressivism of rise of cultures and civilizations, then look, Greece is the mother civilization. And I think my work completely disproves that, because it shows absolutely clearly that, look, you may analyze it whichever way you want, but there is a core of astronomy at the basis of fire altars. You cannot dispute that. And then you see that even in the organization of the Rig Veda, because you cannot say that Rig Veda is subsequent to Euclid. I think this is what exercised a lot of people. But I must also say that my work has been accepted by historians of astronomy. You know, when it comes to essays on history of science in various encyclopedias, they've always come to me. I think there is more opposition amongst certain circles in India, in certain universities, than in the West. You know, you look at the latest UNESCO volume on archaeoastronomy. So they came to me, they said, would you please edit the chapter or the sections on South Asia? I said, certainly I would. So I think it's not even people. It's about where did science arise? What is the kernel and the heart of Indian civilization? Now, when you talk to the best scholars in the West, people who have looked at ritual, like Hesterman from Netherlands, they always said, well, at the basis of ritual is scientific kernel. Right? India is all about being logic, you know, nyaya, or use of logic to the extent it's possible. But there's something more. But I'm probably jumping the gun, and you're going to be asking some questions on that. So let me just stop here for the time being.
Sure, absolutely, I do. You know, when you said that these theories have been accepted in the West and not so much in India, I was reminded of. I think it was the title of a chapter in one of Arun Shoury's books, Eminent Historians, where he writes "Muddai Sust Gava Chust." So, I'm sort of reminded of that. When you talk about, you seem to favor the out of India theory, which is where, and writing around that, you also say that there have been 3 waves before this of major migration from post-Harappan India to the West. You say that the first one was around 4,000 years ago, when colonies were established in Babylonia, Alexandria, Memphis, Rome, around 2,500 years ago. And third, the Gypsies, the Romas, who left India 1,000 years ago as a result of Turkic and Arab invasions. And the people who left were mostly the Rajputs and the Jats. And what is tragic is that the murder of 1 million Roma between 1935 and 1945 scarcely evokes a memory today. We all talk about the horrific genocide of millions of Jews by the Nazis, but for some reason, the murder of 1 million Roma Gypsies is again, barely gets a mention. My question is that earlier you talked about that there was some migration of the very first earliest humans about 80,000 years ago from Africa into India, and then about 40,000 years before present to Europe and other places. How does this fit in with this particular out of India theory, where starting 4,000 years ago there were waves of migration? Where does this seem to fit in? Because so far, a lot of the theories that we are taught, at least in India in school, are that Aryans came in from from Central Europe. How can you talk about this?
I think it all hangs together. Now, I'm not an expert. I'm not a biologist. I don't do population studies. But basically, what I'm doing is arguing or repeating what other experts who do all of that are saying, and primarily Oppenheimer's view about migrations which took place 80,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago out of India. And I also concede that actual events or history must have been much more complicated. And it's not that India was just this reservoir of people and people just kept on leaving and there were not people who were coming back as well. So clearly must have been a very complex process. But now, if you look at the Harappan period, the antecedents of which go back to about 7,500 BC or so, say about 10,000 years ago. And then they have a whole series of cultural transformations which go to this grand period, which has been dated to about 3,300 BC to 2,600 first, and then 2,600 to 1,900, which is where we had the greatest achievements in terms of town planning and the pottery and other artifacts that were created. Now, there is a collapse in 1900 BC. And it's soon after that collapse that we find that people with Sanskritic names in Mesopotamia, the Kassites, and soon afterwards we had the Mitannis, who over generations and generations have Sanskritic names, and they worship Vedic gods. All right. Now, it's also very interesting that this provides the potential for the solution to this big problem, also connected to, where did science arise? Where did art arise? And the problem is you have the Indus script, right? And then you have the Brahmi script, which goes back to Ashokan times, although there are some scholars in Sri Lanka who say that Brahmi in Sri Lanka goes back even earlier to about 500 or 600 BC. Now, Brahmi and the early Asian or West Asian scripts have some connection, but people have completely ignored the fact that the Sanskritic people who were not Iranian, who were Indo-Aryan, and there are some linguistic reasons to see that, because you have the reduplicated T, for example, which you don't find in Iranian, and you find that in Indo-Aryan, which is Sanskrit and Middle Aryan languages. Okay, now the Mitannis had that. They were there in the early 2nd millennium BC, and that's about the time when some of those West Asian scripts arise, right? So that some scholars ought to see this. Now, I have written some papers on that in journals which do cryptologic work, where I've suggested, well, I've only looked at the connection between Indus and Brahmi, and I believe that there are enough grounds to accept that Brahmi is derived from Indus, although that's not the standard view. But it's quite possible that the other scripts from West Asia are also derived from Indus, and that would make a lot of the stuff connected in a sense, which is very logically compelling. But now to come back to your question about movements of people, so we do have that movement of people which went out of India because clearly due to certain climatic event, or maybe the drying up of the Saraswati River, as has been suggested by archaeologists. So there was a movement to the east and there was a movement to the west, and that explains certain connections. Now also in the Harappan period itself, there was tremendous trade between India and Mesopotamia and Egypt. And later on, after the Roman Empire arose, there was tremendous trade between India and Rome. And there's a lot of evidence of that all over India and in the South as well. So people have been going back and forth. And also, India was the most densely populated region of the ancient world. And so it's more likely that people went out, and people must have come in, or the people who came in maybe came in as small minorities or groups, as happened even when the Turks came in. They didn't come in wholesale. They came in as a certain elite group, or the Persians came in as a certain elite group, just as Indians are now going as a elite group to Europe and to Americas. So I don't think there is any contradiction at all between this evidence of movements of Indians outside of India, and also this helps us explain a lot of commonalities that exist. Now, whether that is deep enough for us to explain why we have the same tripartite division of early Roman society as we see in India, which is also a part of the very Vedic view of reality, we don't know. I think that needs a lot of new research. Volume, please. Yes.
So, when you talked about the connection between the Indus and the Brahmi script, I wanted to show a page 84 from your book. I'm going to see. I don't know how legible it is going to be, but I'll hold this up for a couple of seconds, and then I have a question around this. So, if people can make out that this is a table that compares the 10 most commonly found symbols in the script, and my question is that you basically say that okay, so one is that if you look at the deciphering of the Indus script, you do acknowledge that there are a lot of difficulties in deciphering the script, primarily because you don't have lengthy enough pieces that would lend themselves to deciphering. But you then talk about the similarity between the Brahmi and the Indus script, and you looked at the 10 most likely letters from the two scripts, and you say that the probability that the number of matches happening by chance is less than 10 to the power minus 12. I think our audience is less the liberal arts type and more the mathematical and the computer science oriented type. So maybe if you could give us a little more technical background into how you went about performing this analysis, and what you saw as a relationship between the Brahmi and the Sanskrit letters. In your book, you say that this is something that is out of scope of your book, but maybe if you can spend a few minutes for us here.
Sure, Abhinav. This is based on two scholarly papers I wrote for a Western or American journal called Cryptologia. And it's on the web. If people just Google frequency analysis of the Indus script, and the other one is called Indus and Brahmi, further connections. Okay, the argument is somewhat like this. If you look at the Brahmi characters, which are the Sanskrit letters, right? You have, say, 48 of them, and then you have several hundred, 200 or 300 characters of Indus, right? So now the question that I was asking was that if the Sanskritic people came to India after Indus had collapsed, which was the prevailing view, say in the 60s or 70s, then what is the probability that they would look at the shards of pottery on which these Indus characters are inscribed, and then create a script in which the most popular 10, the most commonly occurring 10 characters literally correspond to the 10 most commonly characters that are used for Brahmi. So you can set up a probabilistic argument, which is what I did. And I said the probability of that happening is extremely small. For example, if you look at the most commonly occurring Indus letter, it is the jar letter, right? Now, the most commonly occurring Sanskrit letter is Sa, which also looks like the jar. Or you have Ma of Brahmi, which is like the fish, and that is the second most commonly occurring letter of Indus, the fish sign. Then you have the stick with two legs sign, which is Tha of Brahmi, is the third most commonly occurring. So on probability alone, normally if you go to a certain region, there are two layers of evidence, and they are connected physically, right, in terms of shape, form. You would tend to say, well, they are also genetically connected. One is derived from the other. So this is one of those most astonishing things, that here are scholars or journalists, not necessarily scholars, who say, well, here are these two layers of evidence, but there is no genetic connection at all. We are not going to accept it because it does not correspond with what we favor as what has happened in ancient India.
Fascinating. Moving to the, now I'll move to the Vedas, and here is again something that I think bears. So you write that the central idea behind the Vedic system is the notion of a bandhu, or connections between the astronomical, the terrestrial, and the physiological. I couldn't, while I got some of what you were saying or alluding to, can you elaborate what you really meant by this, three-way connection?
Yeah, well, okay, two things. I think we in India have really lost our true understanding of the Vedas. What are the Vedas? Well, it's captured in the very invocation before the Gayatri Mantra. Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha. This Bhu is the earth, Bhuva is the atmosphere, Swaha is the heavens or the sky. So the basic fundamental idea is that there is this connection, there is this linkage. And you see this everywhere in the ritual, that there is this linkage between the three. And it's because of that linkage that we are able to even comprehend reality. Now, I also did mention, or my research also showed that the number 108, for example, was a part of the very code that was used in the fire altar ritual or in the Ashwamedha ritual. I have a book on that also called the Ashwamedha, or in the organization of the Rig Veda. So what is this number 108? Or why does the Japamala have 108 beats, right? That's because the Vedic astronomers had determined that the sun and the moon are 108 times their respective diameters from the earth. So the whole idea is that just as we want to reach out to the sky, right, metaphorically, so there is a sky within us, which is the lamp of consciousness. So we're making a symbolic journey from the earth, which is our body, through the atmosphere, which are our pranas, into the inner sun. Then as a deity, you might consider inner sun to be Vishnu or goddess or Shiva or whatever else. So now this is a big issue as well in science. How is math able to explain reality to us, or why have we been able to understand reality? I think Eugene Wigner wrote a very famous paper on it called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in Explaining Reality. So I think this thing of connection is this amazing idea that the Vedic rishis had, the bandhu between the earth, the earth, the atmosphere, and the sky. Now, but this is not the only idea. There are two other ideas which I expressed in another of my books called the Prajna Sutras. And there are three essential ideas of the Vedas. One is the bandhu. The other is paroksha, which you see in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, for example. That paroksha kriya idhi deva pratyaksha visha. That there's no simple ideology or set of precepts which explain what reality is, which is also in Mundaka Upanishad, right? There are two kinds of knowledge, the apara and para. Apara is the lower knowledge, which is about things and their relationships, right? Objective knowledge. But then there is a subjective knowledge about the experiencing self, which is para, right? And therefore, between apara and para is paroksha. These are some of the most subtle things that you have in any culture, absolutely inspirational, which is what, people like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or, some of the greatest thinkers all over the world have recognized. And third is the idea of yagya or yajna, right, which is transcendence. which also explains why Hinduism is so many different things to different people, because it has to be. Because we are all at different stages in our personal journeys. And for each stage, we connect to something else, right? And each stage is a sacrifice where you cease to be who you were earlier, which is that sacrificial transcendence. And then you become something else, right? So these are, in my view, the three fundamental ideas which explain the Vedas, the understanding of the rishis, and the Brahmanas and the Puranas and everything else, and Indian music and everything else.
I happened to be watching, as I was preparing the questions to ask, I came across a 10, 12-minute video of yours on YouTube where you talk about quantum theory, and you say that the brain has two levels of functioning, one at a neural level and the other at a quantum level. And when you were talking right now about the Vedas and its wisdom of transcendental unity and duality and so on, you do talk about the relationship between the two in terms of understanding the brain. One level is at understanding it at a neural level, and the other one at a quantum level. And you, if I remember correctly, you also said that Schrodinger's equations, work at a deterministic level, but they happen to break down when you bring in the observer. Could you please elaborate on that?
Okay, well, Schrodinger's story is a very romantic one, and I do mention that in my book, right? Because Schrodinger himself claimed that the idea that a quantum state must be a superposition of all possible states was the Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahman, that this Atman is Brahman, that this small thing is the entire cosmos. That was the key idea that came to him. Well, the problem is this. All of physics, classical physics, Newtonian physics, so all of science is about objects, right? And in quantum mechanics is also about objects, but you have brought in the observer from the back door, so to speak. When you speak of, well, this is what happens when a measurement is made, then the superposition of the quantum state collapses to one of the possibilities by a certain probability, right? But still, how do you define this observer? And quantum mechanics has no place for it. Although quantum mechanics has some very interesting parallels, and these were parallels which were noted by Heisenberg and by others with Vedanta, right? And in fact, the famous biography of Schrodinger by Moore mentions how the very explication of quantum mechanics that took place was totally consistent with Vedanta, because Vedanta is about paroksha at one level. Paroksha are these paradoxes, and you have fundamental paradoxes in quantum mechanics. You have wave and you have particle. The same reality can be seen from, in one prism it's a wave, another prism it's a particle. All right, now so that is one. Now, what about the brain? You have the same problem. In fact, it so turns out that I've been invited to write a paper on consciousness, on which I've been working last couple of weeks, looking at the whole issue of the brain. And neuroscientists have not been able to find a single neural correlate of unified consciousness. Okay? So then the question is, if the brain is a classical machine, like a neural network, of enormous complexity, no doubt, where does consciousness arise, right? Why does this machine, the brain machine, have awareness and freedom, while the silicon machine does not have freedom? Right? Now, there are some people who say, well, it's just the degree of complexity. When the silicon machine itself will become extremely complex, suddenly awareness would arise from somewhere. But I think that's too simplistic. All right, now the deepest theory there is quantum mechanics. And the physical processes inside the brain must have a quantum mechanical, basis. So quantum mechanics, from that perspective, should be a part of brain dynamics. Now, of course, neuroscientists say, well, but there's too much of noise inside the brain, and therefore we cannot see how the equations of quantum mechanics would be valid in our understanding or in our, analysis of brain dynamics. Well, but quantum mechanics need not just deal with physical neural nodes. There could also be higher level virtual entities, just as you can have virtual particles, as in the 0-point vacuum, if you will. There could be similar particles or nodes inside the brain, which are then able to explain the coherence that is a correlate of unified consciousness. But you cannot see it from within if you're looking at neural structures, because they're very far apart. And there are all kinds of paradoxical things that happen inside the brain. For example, a person can lose the capacity to read, which is called alexia because of trauma to the head, but still maintain the capacity to write, so long as the person is not looking at the paper. These are some of those paradoxes, which could perhaps, some of those could be explained if there was a neural model of brain functioning. This is a minority view, I concede that. But there may be potential there for one to push this model further.
Okay, I think this should have whetted the appetite of people to go and look up some of your articles in this area. I want to move, coming to the end of the questions that I had. I want to move to your recent writings for Swarajya magazine itself. And I think the most recent one is where you talk about possible appropriation of Buddhist traditions by Christianity. In your book, towards the latter chapters, you dwell on the same topic, where you write that French missionaries, for example, to Lhasa, who came to that region in the mid-18th century, were astonished by how similar Buddhist ritual was to the Catholic. Your writing, I think, hints, even possibly I would say suggests, that to some degree Jesus himself may have been a myth, a conjuring up by Paul, done much later. And for our viewers, could you also talk about your article where you say that a lot of these Buddhist traditions were appropriated, incorporated into Christianity? So there seems to have been a synthesis, but more of a one-way synthesis of, so to say.
Well, my Swarajya article probably updates what is in the book, because here I mentioned Christian Lindner's work. And it's Christian Lindner, who's a Sanskrit scholar from Denmark, who has examined the original Greek and Aramaic texts of the New Testament Gospels, and he has looked at the corresponding Buddhist texts. And he says, it's his theory, and I have links to his articles. It's his theory which argues that some of the New Testament books are a word for word and sentence for sentence transcription of what is in the corresponding Buddhist texts. Now, what you're saying, there are scholars who claim that the whole Christian tradition was created by Paul. Now, I don't want to get into all of that. It's a very complicated thing, and there are, people who have different views, and it's also a matter of faith for a lot of people. You also have the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, where a lot of what came as a part of the New Testament was already sort of hinted at. And so the whole question of, what is the kernel of Christian belief, and how much of it is based on fact, and how much of it was appropriation. And there is a lot of appropriation which is accepted. For example, the whole story of Barlaam and Josaphat, these were very, very popular saints of the Middle Ages in Europe, and their miracles were celebrated. And as I mentioned in my article, they are a part of the holiday schedule, even in Rome and in Greece. And later on, of course, even the church has admitted that that was all a translation or appropriation of stories from the East. So clearly, I think my part, okay, the other question that you mentioned, or issue that you mentioned, is it was appropriated one way. It doesn't mean, and I think that's a very important point, it doesn't mean that Christianity is Buddhism, because there is a fundamental difference. So these were stories which were put to a specific use. And in my own reading of, say, Greek or European mythology and myths, and the stories in the Puranas, which, as I mentioned earlier, can only be understood through the framework of Bandhu, Paroksha, and Yajna, which not every Indian also knows and recognizes. It seems to have been lost for a long time. There is a difference. There are a lot of parallels, but the degree to which this deep vision arose in India is not to be found. Things are much more superficial. For example, if you look at the Greek myths, the gods live in the heavens. You know, you have Zeus, who's like Dyaus, right? Dyaus in Sanskrit. But it's not at the same subtle level. Which subtle level is captured in our thought through the very idea of Samudra Manthan, that in every creation are these polarities. From the one arise the two, the Devas and the Asuras. And there is this struggle. Within each, there are the Devas and the Asuras. And through that, all the wonderful anubhuti arises. All the wonderful gifts arise, right? And therefore, in the ritual itself, there could be a reading which is Daivik, there is a reading which is Asuric. And I make this, your volume is out, I make this case in my book on Ashwamedha itself, because when you go to many of these Sanskritic courses in Western universities, in fact, I was in Boston a few years ago, and the curator who had done a course in Harvard, she told me, look, the very first lecture, the professor said, hey, this Indian civilization is so crazy. The queen sleeps with the dead horse. And it was a response to that. I wrote that book on Ashwamedha. Well, within India, there were those who took a Asuric reading of the ritual, because the ritual was such that it offered everything to everybody based on where you were. Because we start off, if one were to say, in an Asuric form where we believe that our bodies are everything, which is what the Asuric means, you know, to conflate ourself with the body. That is the Asuric view. And there's a wonderful dialogue on that in Chandogya Upanishad, for example. And then slowly you go further and you come to the Daivik understanding, which takes you to a higher level where you are much more in tune with the very heart of your being.
You know, very pertinent point. In the first half of your book, when you're comparing Greek and Hindu mythologies, you detail while, you know, the Indian stories are according to a self-conscious logic, as you write. The European stories, on the other hand, are very disconnected, and you cite examples to show that how the origin of these myths, of these stories, would have to be there for Indian and not not Greek or European, because of the degree of completeness that is exhibited in the Indian epics and the Indian books rather than the European ones. I want to now open up this Q&A to our audience. So you have two ways in which you can ask questions. One is if you send in your question over chat, I will read it out and then have Professor Kak answer it. The second is you can unmute your line and directly ask the question. And while you're thinking and composing your questions, I will go through the chat window and see if any questions have come in the last, since we started this chat. And I do see a few of them. I will start going through them. So one is, why did, so here's the question, Professor. Why did congregational worship, as in Abrahamic movements like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, not get invented or established as a norm in the Indian civilization? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, it did. You look at Buddhism. Buddhism is Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, but also Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. See, the Buddhist movement was congregational. That's why we find such parallels between Buddhism and Christianity. But the general religion, if I may use that term, that's not the right term really, Sanatana Dharma, if you will, was not congregational because of the very idea of personal journey. You know, the heart of Sanatana Dharma is, I've used the image of if we are a bird and we are stuck in this brush on the ground, you have to walk through the brush, go to the highest point, and only then can you fly, right? Which in the Yoga Sutras is, let's say, Kaivalyam, right? So it's all about being connected to the right stage where you can draw upon what the congregation is to offer you. Therefore, in that sense, Buddhism was a innovation, and perhaps now that the whole world has become a globe, has become a single village, if you will, maybe Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma also needs to create new ways where people can partake of the knowledge that is available, because modern times both isolate you and connect you at the same time. So since you do need connection, how do you do that? So maybe a kind of a sangha in the sense of what Buddha created is also required. And in that sense, perhaps Buddhism is a part of Sanatana Dharma, right? But then it has this emphasis on shunyata too much, at least in Mahayana, where it doesn't go all the way to these three legs that I spoke about. And therefore, okay, Buddhism is Sanatana Dharma to a certain extent, but if you want to go beyond that, then you need something more. And we need Sangha for that. And maybe efforts like this one are a part of that.
Okay, fascinating. It's one, in some sense, one could also, however, make the point that Buddhism, was born and it evolved at a time that was, several centuries before the advent of Christianity and certainly, before Islam. So was it again a question of some of the elements of, what do you say, Sangham Gacchami and Sangham Sharanam Gacchami? Was that aspect then taken from Buddhism into Christianity, or, what aspects of it came the other way? But it's a fascinating question. I'll move to the next one, which is that this is from Akash, and he writes: do you think objective science will ever arrive at the origin of consciousness? If no, does that mean the tussle between scientific materialism and Vedanta will go on indefinitely? That is the question. I also wanted to add, if you read some of the literature that's been coming out, some of the nonfiction, sort of popular nonfiction books, one is The Rise of the Robots by Martin Ford, and the Coming Singularity, or some such name, that argues that the singularity is now not a question of if, but a question of when, and some postulate a time period of anywhere from 10 to 15 years before machines will get the kind of consciousness that that you have been saying that it's possibly not going to happen.
The question, the first one is a very good one. I don't think objective science will ever be able to explain consciousness, and that is something that Mundaka Upanishad, that is the Indian view, that that even the Vedas, in the Mundaka Upanishad, the Vedas are also lower knowledge. They are also apara, because para knowledge can only be intuited, can only be experienced. But the beauty of the Vedic system, which is why they are so relevant, because one could very easily say, why do stuff which is 5,000 or 4,000 or thousands of years old? Well, in many ways, Vedas, and I'm talking about Vedas as an entire system, the Upanishads, and everything else, even the Puranas, which if you knew what the grammar was, even the Puranas, some of which people may not have appreciated in the past, become beautiful. So the Vedas touch upon the mystery of reality in a sense that no other literature does. So they're greatly inspirational. And the Vedas say, well, this is just to indicate to you what reality is. You know, in Indian aesthetics, it's also stated that you can really not teach anybody. People must arrive at that understanding on their own. You can only have the dhvani associated with that teaching. You can only suggest it. You cannot, you know, push it down or shove it down anybody's throat, so to speak. So, so I think the beauty of the Vedic texts or the Indian texts is that they go to the very heart of the mystery, and that heart of the mystery is more important than ever before in modern times. Why? Because the West, in its pushing of technology to the extent it can be pushed, right? Creating machines. That's where that inflection point comes in. Has reached a point where these machines will be bereft of spirit because they can only do things which they are asked to do. And therefore, the very question of who we are and what that reality is becomes even more urgent. And in that sense, as things become worse, and a lot of the disorder that we see around the world is a consequence of pushing the machine paradigm to the extent it can be pushed. As things get worse, that's when the hunger and thirst for deeper knowledge will also become greater. So I think there is a kind of a confluence taking place between where science is going, and a lot of that is also inspired by Indian thoughts. Let's not forget that. You know, quantum mechanics, some of the smartest people that I know many Nobel Prize winners and others, they are truly inspired by Indian thoughts, because Indian thought is not dogmatic. All that it's saying is that, look, there is a deeper level, because if it is all material things, then how would consciousness arise? And what is the mystery of our own being? So I think it's just fantastic.
You know, as you were talking, sort of a question came to my mind, which is that given that Vedic teaching, the principles of Vedic thought have been they are in many ways so different from the way in which modern science and mathematics is taught today, which is in a very deterministic manner. How do Indians retain hold over that part? Because it is in some ways a tragic fact that if one undergoes a modern Indian education, then it is fundamentally at odds with the Vedic system of imbibing knowledge. What do you have any thoughts on how this can be preserved at any level?
Well, it's a challenge in the West as well. The education in the West deadens students. That's why they opt out. They get into drugs or whatever else. And they say, well, science is not for us, which is why, there are not too many people doing science in the West. They say, well, it's all a machine, so we're going to die. So let's just enjoy life or do whatever, do music or get high, right? Well, but it can be done. Why can it be done? Because if you truly look at science itself, it has all kinds of paradoxes. And if you teach science through its paradoxes, see, for example, quantum mechanics, you have Wheeler's delayed choice paradox, which says what you do now can influence the remote past, right? Impossible. But it's a part of quantum mechanics, and it's been shown in the lab setting. So I think what one has to do is to point to these paradoxes as points of inspiration, not just to say that it means that you have to give up on science. No, the Vedic view, and this is a fantastic dialogue, which is in the Bhagavad Puran, where I think Yudhishthir approaches Narada and says, what is life all about? He says, well, you must do this and you must learn this and this, but finally you must confront paradoxes for Roksha, right? And that's what really life is for everybody, no matter what one is doing. Even in business, there are paradoxes. Okay, everything is going well, and then suddenly the Great Recession occurs from nowhere, or we might be in the throes of another one right now. And so all ideologies are good only for a certain period of time. And what the Vedas teach us, it's not to discover lost science. What they teach us is a certain attitude of which helps us get connected with the mystery within our own heart, which empowers us in a fashion so that we can even do the problems of the day, you know, the usual problems that we must confront with in a more creative way, in a way where we can go out of the box. And when we go out of the box, then we see infinite possibilities that others are not seeing, which is when we become creative or leaders. So I think it is there. It's not just for the esoteric and for people who are interested in consciousness science or philosophy and so on. It's for everyone to be in touch with their own self and to be in touch with the environment around us, with society around us.
Okay. There was one, I'm doing a quick time check and we are actually past the hour. So what I would do is, one is that you are, active on Twitter. So you do have a Twitter handle, and, I'll share the link to the audio and the video recording after this. Before closing, I wanted to check if we have Ram Rani ji with us also on this webinar, and if she wanted to share her thoughts, because she had, she had a response to an earlier question, which was, what were some of the elements that got shared or taken from Buddhism into Christianity. If she's online, I wonder if she could briefly talk about those. I could read out some of her comments that she has sent, but if she's online, would she mind talking to those points?
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
All right. What I sent in was about how some of the documented situations of Buddhist influence in the Fertile Crescent. I was sent that issue in about how Paul said, I give my body to be burned, and it from 1 Corinthians. I seem to have.
Clear.
I have to be having a problem here.
No, it's not very clear.
I'm having very slow internet, and I keep losing you. So, yeah. Well, one thing, if you can hear me, that I think is irrefutable is that John the Baptist was Jesus' guru, and John the Baptist was on his scene, and the Essenes were highly influenced by the Buddhist missionaries. They used candles, they used puja lights, they used incense, they lived in the desert, they begged for food, they were celibacy, they didn't get married. They were just like step-by-step Buddhist influence. And Jesus his guru was John the Baptist, who was an Essene. So you can just look at step-by-step how the Essenes differed from their Jewish parents and its Buddhist influence. I mean, there's no doubt about it in my mind. And I think anybody who has an open mind to that will see it too.
Right. Let me also make one additional point. Sometimes people in India tend to see India only in geographical terms, that here is what arose. So let's only look at dharma as it arose in India. Well, I think the world has changed. India is an idea now. The whole world is India. I think at least that's how we should see it. We are all the same. All human beings are the same. We're all brothers and sisters. And so what is knowledge for India is also knowledge for everybody else. So I think where a new initiative is needed in India is to be a bit more outgoing and not just look within, but also look without. And there are groups all over the world, and we see fantastic articulators of that, such as Tulsi Gabbard, who it's quite possible might be president in some time because she's extremely talented. And so there are people who are not, in terms of their origin connected to India in any way, who are so passionately devoted to the Sanatan Dharma. So we need to go out and be connected. In Bali, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, the Champa, there are 15% of the Chams are still connected, but Indians have not even reached out to them. So people everywhere. So in other words, we need to look at Vedas and Sanatan Dharma as humanity's something that humanity owes. And we need to do whatever needs to be done to bring it to other people who might be so interested. It's not a dogmatic thing. You've got to be at a certain level where you would say, oh, this is fantastic. I want to know what this mystery is. And here is something that provides answers.
Thank you, Ram Raniji, and thank you, Professor Kak. We are, 8 minutes past the top of the hour, so I will bring this webinar to an end now. I want to thank everyone who, took this time on a Sunday evening to dial in, and especially Professor Kak, who, is taking this time off on his Sunday morning. I will be putting these links up on SoundCloud and on YouTube. And for those willing, they can follow Professor Kak on Twitter at his handle is Subhash Kak1, the number 1, all one word. So thank you once again. Have a good night, and we'll stay connected on Twitter again. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhinav. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.